Good evening, everyone. I'm Joanne Myers, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to thank you all for joining us on this very special evening as we welcome the eminent Harvard scholar, Dr. Graham Allison. Tonight, he will be discussing his very timely book entitled Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? This book is the result of a 5-year research project conducted as part of the Applied History Project at the Kennedy Belford Center. Destined for War has been noted as a New York Times Editor's Choice and an Amazon Best History Book of 2017. And it will be available for you to purchase at the end of the hour tonight. For some time, we've been hearing about the aggressive nature of U.S.-Chinese relations, especially now as Donald Trump pursues his quest to make America great again, while President Xi talks of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This ongoing rivalry is based on the steep and threatening economic and military rise of China and a growing belief in America's decline as a shining city on the hill and the last hope of mankind. While the Trump administration continues to withdraw from the world, China has become more engaged, positioning itself to be the world's other superpower, signaling that China is now an alternative, not just a rival to the United States. One wonders if this will be the trigger that launches a major confrontation. In Destined for War, Dr. Allison uses his impressive command of history, geopolitical and military knowledge to explore how America and China may be on a collision course, what he calls the Thucydides trap. This metaphor, coined by Dr. Allison, serves as a vivid reminder of the inevitable structural stress that occurs when a rapidly rising power threatens to displace a ruling one. It was described by the ancient Greek historian Thucydides to explain the Peloponnesian War, which began with the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta, the prevailing power, making war inevitable. Drawing on numerous examples over the last 500 years of violent clashes between rising and established powers, Dr. Allison tells us that it is not just extraordinary, unexpected, ordinary flashpoints of foreign affairs that can trigger large-scale conflict. The question that follows is, what can be done to ensure that the current rivalry between a rapidly ascending China and the predominance of the U.S. does not end in catastrophic incidents? Can we escape the Thucydides trap? To address this question, please join me in welcoming Dr. Allison as he takes us on an intellectual odyssey through history, one that will give us the tools to think more intelligently about one of the major geopolitical challenges to world order. Dr. Allison, thank you for joining us.
So thank you very much for such a kind introduction. And you're obviously a very good reader of the book, but also very good at getting to the heart of the matter. So I think you've gotten a little preview there. So what I'm going to do in about 30 minutes, not more, is try to introduce you to the book, the argument of the book, and particularly the question of why I think it's important and even compelling relevance for us for thinking Americans here now, particularly folks like you at the Carnegie Council. So the book has been out, it was published Memorial Day, so about 4 months, and I've been very happy, gratified with the reception of the book, both it's widely reviewed in all the relevant, the Times, the Post, the Journal, the FT, and so forth, and mostly favorably, including a Sunday New York Times cover page review. It's jumped onto the bestseller list fairly quickly, and it's stayed there. The ideas have entered the policy bloodstream very quickly, and so H.R. McMaster, who's Trump's national security advisor, had actually read the page proofs of the book because he was reviewing it for IASS, but once he was appointed, he thought it was probably not appropriate to be touting a book, but he and I have talked about it frequently. He's thoughtful about this. Jim Mattis, who's the Secretary of Defense, a big Thucydides fan. Actually, Bannon is a Thucydides reader as well, so it's more complicated than that. And if you were watching in Beijing last week, Xi Jinping was crowned the new emperor of China, but among the other things he talked about in his speech was Thucydides trap. So the topic is certainly in the stream. And in fact, I think the book provides a takeaway for readers that, as Henry Kissinger said about it, provides a lens, the best lens available, Henry says, for looking through the news and noise of the day to the underlying dynamic in the relationship between China and the U.S. This book, it's meant for people in the policy community, but also in the intelligent reading public. A lot of people have said that it was quite readable, so I hope that's right. And the other thing that I like that people have said is that they learn something that makes them go, aha, or feel a little smarter, at least every other page. So if that's correct, that's also a benefit. Because in fact, what I do at the beginning of each do a little epigraph from Thucydides. So it's for sure you get a burst every beginning of each chapter. So the book and tonight does three things. First, it introduces you to a great thinker. And before you're done tonight, those of you who haven't met him before will or will be reintroduced to a great thinker. It presents a big idea, and it imposes a consequential question. So the great thinker is Thucydides. And probably not for this audience, but certainly for more general American audiences, I've learned that this is a mouthful. So I want us to make sure we can all feel comfortable pronouncing this fellow's name. So 1, 2, 3, Thucydides. Let's do it one more time. Thucydides. So if nothing else tonight, you learned how to pronounce the name of the father and founder of history. Thucydides wrote the first ever history book. History defined as an accurate account of what happened and why without any interference from spirits or myths or other external themes of the sort that Herodotus was given to including in his story. So Thucydides just tried to get the facts right. And he did so in a famous book on classical Greece called The History, that's why he calls that the name, of the Peloponnesian War. And you can actually go download that for free. Read just book 1, the first 100 pages. If it doesn't knock your socks off every other page, check your pulse. Okay? So this is a very, very thoughtful fellow. So Thucydides. The big idea is an idea that was, as said, I coined about, 6 years ago, called Thucydides trap. A metaphor to make vivid Thucydides' insight. So this is his idea, not Graham's idea, that when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, like Athens impacted Sparta, which had been the dominant power in Greece for 100 years, or Germany impacted Britain 120 years or so ago. That was the roll-up to World War I, even though Britain had been the dominant power for a century, or China is impacting the U.S. today. So when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, in general, poop happens. So Thucydides' trap is the dangerous dynamic that occurs in this interaction between a rising power that's threatening to displace a ruling power. And in the book, I review the last 500 years of history. I found 16 cases of this phenomena, of which, say, the rise of Germany and its impact on Britain is a good example. In 12 of these cases, the outcome was war. In 4 of the cases, the outcome was not war. So to say that under these conditions war is inevitable would be mistaken. And this book does not say war is inevitable. To say that under these conditions, war is possible, even likely, even that the odds are against us, would be accurate. So that's Thucydides' trap. And finally, the question is the subtitle of the book that's already been mentioned, which is, can America and China escape Thucydides' trap? And that's, I think, the question. So why don't I take about 20 minutes left to organize my comments around as answers to 3 questions. So I'll give you 3 questions. For each of them, I'll give you the tweet-size answer in respect of Washington today. And then I'll say a little bit more, since we have a little bit more time than a tweet. Okay. So question 1. What has been the geopolitical event of the last generation, the last 25 years? The most significant geopolitical event the last 25 years. Second question, what will be the most significant geostrategic challenge for the U.S. for the next 25 years? So from this point, looking forward as far as anybody can see. And third, this nagging question, can America and China escape Thucydides' trap? So first, the tweet-size answers.
Kissinger, Nixon to China.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to that.
Well, I thought you were asking.
We will. No, I'm going to tell you my answer. No, we're going to come back. No, you're good. You're good. I appreciate audience participation. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. So my tweets are, first, the geopolitical event of the last 25 years has been the rise of China. So consistent with yours. Never before has a country risen so far, so fast, on so many different dimensions. Indeed, for those of you who haven't been watching, the first chapter of the book gives you a good jolt. Okay? And I quote former Czech President Václav Havel's wonderful comment, things have happened so fast, we haven't yet had time to be astonished. Okay? So I would say, look at the facts and be astonished. Looking forward the next 25 years, or as far as anybody can see, the geostrategic challenge will be, my tweet, the impact of the rise of China on the U.S. and on American sense of our role in the world and on the international order that the U.S. constructed and has largely underwritten for the last 7 decades. So the impact of the rise of China on the U.S. and the international order. And if I were given a few more characters for my tweet, I would say, not coincidentally, 7 decades without great power war, which should not be taken for granted, because as John Gaddis has explained in a wonderful essay, he's a historian at Yale, that's called The Long Peace, these 7 decades are anomalous and not accidental. They're the result of this order that the U.S. constructed after World War II and has maintained for these decades. So finally, can America and China escape Thucydides' trap? The third question. There, the book retreats to the professorial perch. Actually, that's my job most of the time, and answers decisively no and yes. Okay? So let me explain. So no, if we insist on business as usual in relations with China, and that's, I think, what we've seen the last 20 years under both Republicans and Democrats, then we should expect history as usual. And history as usual in this case would be war, indeed, God forbid, a catastrophic war. So no, if we insist on business as usual. But yes, we can escape Thucydides' trap if we take seriously Santayana's insight, in which he said, only those who refuse to study history are condemned to repeat it. So we're not obliged to make the mistakes that the Kaiser made in 1914, or that Pericles made in 431 when Coursera and Corinth got into a conflict. So there are plenty of mistakes that others have made that we don't necessarily have to repeat, though we will do if we just do business as usual. So no and yes. Let me say a few more words about each, but that's the frame. So to the first question, the biggest geopolitical event the last 25 years, the rise of China. If you haven't been watching, I think you'll find that this 20 pages, the chapter 1 on the rise of China, a jolt. And when I do the presentation of it with slides, I would show you the slide of the bridge that goes across the Charles River in Cambridge between the Kennedy School and the business school. It's called the Anderson Bridge. I can see this bridge out of my office. So the renovation of this bridge, the discussion of it began when I was dean of the Kennedy School. And I quit being dean in 1989. The construction project began in earnest in 2012 and was declared to be a 2-year project. In 2014, it was declared it wasn't finished. That was obvious for anybody to see with the big traffic jams. And they said it would take 1 more year. In 2015, they said it wasn't finished. It would take 1 more year. In 2016, they said, we're not going to tell you when it's going to be finished. Okay? But it was already 3 times over budget. And now, actually, all the traffic works on it. They just still haven't quite finished it. There's a bridge in Beijing that I drove across 2 months ago when I was there, called the Sanyan Bridge, S-A-N-Y-A-U-N. It's got 3 times more lanes of traffic than the Anderson Bridge, so it's bigger. Okay. In 2015, the Chinese decided they wanted to renovate the Sanyan Bridge. How long did it take to complete that project? Take a guess. 18 months? Another guess? 43 hours. 43 hours. You could go to YouTube and you put in 43-hour China Bridge or put in Sanyan Bridge. You could see the video speeded up with a timeline of this project. Now I know in New York, the 2nd Avenue subway only took, so you're not like Boston, okay? How many miles of high-speed rail has the U.S. successfully constructed that are operating today? Answer 0. Okay. And we have one project that's actually been very active. It's from San Francisco to Los Angeles. It was started 10 years ago, and it was announced to be done in 2017. I think that was this year, okay? It was then announced that it might be finished in 2029. That's the current estimate. And many people in California think that it'll never be finished. Yeah? In the same 10-year period, when we were not building the 500 miles, China built and are now operating how many miles of high-speed rail? 16,000. Okay. So you get on a train in Beijing and you're in Shanghai in 1 hour and 20 minutes. And if we had a high-speed rail, I would be able to go to Boston, in 1 hour and 10 minutes. And I'd be able to go to Washington from Boston in 1 hour and 45 minutes. Subways, look at airports, and on and on and on. In the course I teach at Harvard, it's mainly for Kennedy School students, so I have 10 undergraduates among the 60. And each year I give them a quiz. The quiz is at the top of the page. When could China become #1? And I give a little, a short version of this in the book. #1, largest middle class. #1, produce the most cell phones or smartphones, most computers, largest number of billionaires, fastest supercomputer, largest national economy. So 26 indicators. And they have to write their answers, 2030, 2040, not in my lifetime. And then I give them a second slide, the same 26 indicators, but the top of it says already. So all those things already happened. Most Americans, of course, haven't noticed. As I say, we haven't yet had time to be astonished. But you look at the facts. In fact, most Americans don't know that China today has the largest national economy, bigger than the American economy. Well, no, that can't be. I read in the paper always that, China is the second largest economy. Go to the IMF website. Go to the CIA website. Take the yardstick they regard as the single best yardstick for comparing national economies. That's called purchasing power parity. You'll see China's economy is today bigger than America's economy, than the U.S. economy. Well, that shouldn't be. I don't like that. I think our economy should be the biggest economy. Well, that's good. I like that too. But the facts are hard to deny. So the first proposition is that what's happened literally in the 25 years that, we're old enough to remember where we were 25 years ago. Most of us, not you, but for the most of the people. So while we have hardly been watching, this meteoric rise has just in every dimension. And China will be rivaling and in many domains surpassing the US over this period of time, as it already has been and for some time to come. So that's the past, looking to the future. The geostrategic challenge, as I said, is the impact of this. And this is really, again, Thucydides' idea. So I'm the ruling power. Sparta, Britain. I've been the ruling power, US, for 100 years. So this is natural. This is the way things should be. They were all my life. Actually, this is a good way for things to be. So this is not just the status quo, this is the international order. Actually, it's the international order we constructed and we've maintained. And without this international order, you, upstart, wouldn't even have had a chance to become an upstart. So actually, the Asian order that the US has provided for the 7 decades since World War II, the economic and security order, has provided the environment that's enabled all of the Asian miracles. They would not have occurred in the absence of that. And nobody has benefited more from this than China. So when I was working in the US government, I often explained to them why they should be so grateful for this. And they should, I think. Indeed, we try to explain to them why they should help pay for it. They should share more responsibilities. And they say, as Athens said to Sparta, but you put all this in place before we even got here. You didn't take account of our interests because we didn't even count when you established this order. As the Chinese tell us, you wrote the rules for what is the IMF and what is the World Bank and what is the alliance structure. You didn't consult us. So in this dynamic, the rising power naturally feels I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I deserve more say, I deserve more sway. This current situation is unfair. Doesn't really rate my interest, consistent with my size and scale. And if you listened last week to what was going on in Beijing, that's precisely the subtext of Xi Jinping's message, that we are finally now standing up to be big and strong the way we always were until some foreigners showed up about 200 years ago, these Europeans with technology, and they humiliated us, and the Americans came on to help. But now we're bigger, we're stronger, so we're standing up for ourselves. And the ruling power, the US, says, wait a minute, you're trying to upset the status quo. Indeed, you're trying to undo the whole international order. And what are the consequences of that going to be? And that story is as old as history itself. Okay? And we can see how those dynamics work. So I describe those in the book, and you can see the elements of it, but I think the impact of the rise of China on Americans' sense even of who we are and our role in the world you can already see in part. This book was not written with Donald Trump in mind. Actually, it was completed before he was elected. But I have in the preface just 2-3 pages that note that Thucydides wouldn't be all that surprised at the campaign that was run and even the election of somebody like Trump, because he would say ruling powers become insecure and they become fearful. Even in the extreme, they can become paranoid. Remember what in Greek comes right after fear comes extreme and paranoid. And in the campaign, the principal obstacle to American greatness, according to Donald Trump, was China, which has been raping our economy, he said, and so forth and so on. So this impact, I think, we haven't seen the end of. We're actually only seeing the beginnings of. But I think anybody who missed China's ambition to, as Xi Jinping said last week, stand tall and be strong in the East. And as I explained in the book, and this comes from Lee Kuan Yew, who was the person that knew China the best, he's to the question, are these folks serious about displacing the U.S. as the predominant power in Asia in the foreseeable future? I have in the book. He says, of course, why not? Who could expect them to do otherwise? How could they not want to be the dominant power in Asia? But wait a minute, but we're the dominant power in Asia. And our dominance has provided this environment that so there's the rub. Okay. Finally, can America and China escape Thucydides' trap? So Thucydides' idea is not, so let me make sure what it's not. It is not that because the rising power is getting bigger and stronger, it says, I'm big, I'm strong, it's time for me to attack you. And it's not because the ruling power says, well, look at this upstart. He's already almost as big as I am. If I leave him alone, tomorrow he's going to be even stronger. I better fight him now. That's not what happens. What happens is, caught in this dangerous dynamic, third-party actions become provocations to which one or the other feels obliged to react, to which the other primary actor feels obliged to respond, which then lead to a cascade, often dragging people where they don't want to go. So how did the assassination of an archduke in 1914 produce a conflagration that burned out the whole of Europe? I mean, at the end of which it was so devastated that historians had to create a whole new category. That's why it's called World War I. It's a puzzle. I mean, I have a good chapter on it in the book. It's a question I've asked for, since I was a student at Harvard. I still can't believe it. I can't understand it. It doesn't make any sense. After the war, every one of the principal actors had lost what he cared about most. So the Austro-Hungarian emperor is trying to hold his empire together. Empire's dissolved, he's gone. Russian Tsar is trying to back the Serbs. His whole regime been overthrown by the Bolsheviks, the communists. Kaiser is trying to back his only ally in Vienna. He's been tossed out. France is military allied with Russia. It's been bled of its youth for a whole generation, never recovers as a player in international affairs. And Britain, which had been a creditor for 100 years, has been turned into a debtor and is on a slow slide to decline. So if you'd given the people a chance for a do-over, nobody would have chosen this. But they did, and it happened. So who is our best candidate for a provocateur in the current dynamic between U.S. and China? Well, watch this week. Watch this space. Kim Jong-un. Could Kim Jong-un drag the U.S. and China into war? Never. It's impossible. I asked this for the PLA Senior Colonel's Academy when I was there 2 months ago. This young colonel said, absolutely not. No way. He said, nobody in China wants to have a war with U.S. Not one person. Be crazy. So it can't happen. So I said, well, I thank you. But when I've studied, it says, Chinese study history a lot. Anybody else have a view? So this other senior colonel, he said, let me answer. Of course they could. The reason why, of course, they could, they already did. This already happened in 1950. The young man said, I wasn't born. That's okay. I can't help that. Okay. In 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea. North Koreans right back up the peninsula, right across the 38th parallel. MacArthur thought he was going to finish all the business by Christmas and we were coming home. Korea was going to be unified. Out of the blue came 300,000 Chinese and then another 500,000. Beat us right back down the peninsula to the 38th parallel where the armistice. So tens of thousands of Americans, hundreds of thousands of Chinese, millions of Koreans died in this war. Most of the Americans were killed by Chinese. Most of the Chinese were killed by Americans. Did anybody want a war between the US and China? No. Mao had only the year before barely consolidated control of China. The US was Superman. We had just dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 5 years before to end World War II. So the idea you're going to attack Superman, I mean, forget about it. But they did, and it happened. So watch this space. In the months immediately ahead, either Kim Jong-un is going to conduct more ICBM tests, and after the next series or the series after that, but not a year, before a year's out, he's going to have the ability to strike San Francisco or Los Angeles with a nuclear warhead. So that's inconceivable, but I'm telling you that's a fact. Or somebody's going to attack him to prevent this from happening. Or there's going to be a miracle. So I'm praying for a miracle, okay? But that's hard to count on. Well, how bad would it be if Kim Jong-un can be able to attack San Francisco? Working on his program pretty soon. He'll be able to get a nuclear weapon to New York. Oh my God, or Boston. Yikes. Is he going to attack us? No. Because he knows we would respond and destroy his society. But if he succeeds in having the ability to attack us, what else is he going to do? Well, we can go down that in the questions if you want to. Or, and this is exactly what Donald Trump told Xi Jinping when they first met, which was in Mar-a-Lago in April, he said to him, you can solve this problem. You're a big country. This is a little country right beside you. You can solve this problem. But if you don't solve this problem, I'm going to solve the problem. Because I'm telling you, there's no way in hell Kim Jong-un is going to be able to attack America with nuclear weapons. But he said, but if I do it, you're not going to like it. So he served him chocolate cake. This was the opening dinner. He excused himself, went to the room next door, and announced that the US had just launched 59 cruise missiles against Syria, just to make the point of how we might do this. Okay? So will Trump attack North Korea in the months immediately ahead? He might. And if he does, will the North Koreans attack Seoul? Almost certainly. And if they attack Seoul, will we then destroy the artillery and the rockets that can do more damage to Seoul? Probably. And if we do that, will we have a second Korean War? Likely. If we have a second Korean War, will China become a combatant? Likely. You think, well, this is crazy. 1950 was pretty crazy too, okay? Crazy things happen. So to conclude, the purpose of this book is not to be fatalistic. It's not to be pessimistic. I'm inherently optimistic. It is to say the dangerous dynamic that we find ourselves in creates extreme danger that we wouldn't otherwise face or wouldn't otherwise recognize. And under conditions of extreme danger, one requires extreme actions, more imagination than you would normally have. So business as usual, no, you've got to stretch imaginations. More adaptability than one would normally have. So I'm hoping what the book will do is help the thinking American community and the American policy community first recognize, yes, this is extremely dangerous. There's no simple way to escape these conditions. This is going to be a chronic condition for years to come, decades probably to come. And to deal with it successfully, we will have to have as much imagination and as much adaptability as, for example, the U.S. displayed in creating what was ultimately the Cold War strategy. So it's not like this is beyond human capacity, not even beyond American capacity, just not normal. So can the U.S. and China escape Thucydides' trap? The answer is no and yes. I'm happy to take questions. Yes, sir. Oh,
Thank
I'm
you
sorry.
very much. I think you're either pessimistic, optimistic, but probably realistic. So I thank you very much for really a wonderful discussion, and I know there are going to be many questions. So I ask that you just go to the microphones on either side and introduce yourself and try to keep your question brief and to the point because
why
there
don't
will
we
be
start
many.
here?
Okay, we'll start over here.
My name is Larry Bridwell. I teach at Pace University. In fact, I just finished teaching about your Essence of Decision book
thank you.
last night, so it's a great book. My question is that one possibility to force China to deal with North Korea is for President Trump simply to announce that 6 months from now there will be a complete total trade embargo against China unless they take decisive action. What would be your assessment of that option?
Okay, thank you. It's a good question. So I'm trying to give short answers because all these deserve long answers, but I'm not trying to not take the question seriously. I think for most of us, when we think about North Korea and we think about Donald Trump, we decide to blame him, not you, okay? The fact is, he inherited a failing hand. North Korea had already gotten nuclear weapons, 50, had already got short-range missiles to hit South Korea, had already got medium-range missiles to hit Japan, and was on the verge of getting missiles to hit America. That's when he came, okay, late to the party. And he looked at it and he said, this is crazy. I can't even believe this. I mean, he had never heard of it before. It wasn't part of his, not what he had been thinking about or working on. So he immediately, when he heard about this from President Obama in the handoff in between, he went out just from the meeting and tweeted, not going to happen. I don't know what Obama did. I don't know what Clinton did. I don't know what Bush did, but I'm telling you, I'm in trouble. It's not going to happen. So what he's been trying to do, I think, first he wanted to threaten economics. Then he decided, well, I don't know how that's going to work. So I think if you were to have what's the method in the madness at this point, it's that to persuade Xi Jinping that I really am crazy enough to attack North Korea, even though I know what all the risks are. Unless you do something, so you better do something. So the strategy is to move Xi to squeeze the oil lifeline to get Kim Jong-un at least to stop testing. I think it's possible this will happen. And that'll be part of the conversation. Whether, if one said and could plausibly say, in 6 months the U.S. is going to have a total trade embargo with China, the question is whether this is credible, whether it be sustainable, and what the consequences would be for us. Always in the cases of deterrence or coercion, it has to be believable that I'll really do it and it won't hurt me more. So if we were to have no trade with China, Walmarts would become empty. Americans don't like Walmarts to be empty, so there would be a lot of noise about that. Chinese factories, of course, would be producing for nobody because there's nobody, buying the stuff the way we do. We would have some problems getting probably financing our deficit, so there's that component of it, since we still borrow money every year to pay for our budget. So I'm sure one could look at that, and it's actually the fellow who does trade in the Trump administration, Navarro, has been talking in this space. But I think people might be worried that it would impact us more, and therefore it wouldn't be credible. But there are no easy answers in this space as we're dealing with North Korea. Yes.
Yes, I'm David Pruden, and I'm a master's student at Columbia University.
Oh,
I bought your book the day it came out and read it. Excellent book. Thank you for it.
Oh, thank you.
As you said, China had really no role in designing the IMF and the World Bank. Could you please give your assessment of these alternative economic governance organizations that China has started to lead, such as the BRICS New Development Bank, One Belt, One Road, the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, and how China is calibrating, balancing those alternative institutions with the existing order that, as you pointed out, China has benefited from more than anyone else?
That's a very good question, and it'd be worth a side discussion, because I'm fascinated by it. So here you have a rising China. The system was set up before they counted, even though, for example, they got a seat on the UN Security Council because they were a big country, even though at the time it was just unsettled who was even going to rule China, and you had Taiwan and Beijing continuing a civil war. But the Americans, setting up both the IMF and the World Bank, which were fantastic organizations, and for the benefit of the whole world, did set the rules. And so the rules say the president of the World Bank will be an American, and the first deputy in the IMF will be an American. And the Americans will have enough votes in the IMF that if we want to veto something about the governance, we can. So in the World Bank case, China first sort of said, well, we need a little more voting shares, because voting shares are distributed in terms of your contributions to the capital. And the US said, well, I don't know. Congress said, no. So the Chinese said, well, maybe we'll start our own bank. If we got the money. So currently, the Chinese development banks today give away 4 times as much loans as the World Bank. So they already have their own. They got the Asian Development Bank, they got this infrastructure bank, they've got the lending for the One Belt, One Road, and they have so they have a series, 4 or 5 of these. They got an agricultural bank, take them all together 4 times. Okay. In the IMF, it's interesting. So this now gets into the weeds, but in the IMF, the question is, how do you decide which is the biggest economy? Well, when they do their reports, they use purchasing power parity, and they say China's the biggest economy. But for distributing shares, if they said that, the fact that the US has enough shares to block any changes in governance would change. And the US has enough shares to block that, so we will not let them calculate the size of the government for the purposes of shares using the measure they use in their statistics. So they've made a deal where we do 60% market exchange rates and 40% purchasing power parity, which just allows us to keep our 17% shares, which just allows us to keep our veto. Because actually, if ever China became the largest shareholder in the IMF could move. So the headquarters of the IMF is in the country that has the largest number of shares. And you can be sure Washington is not interested in that happening. So China now looking at its options even in the financial space. The fact that the dollar is the reserve currency and the RMB is having to try to make its way, and the RMB is much more controlled, makes it more difficult. But in any case, they're looking at the space. So if that's an area you're studying as a student, I would say look into it, because it's just ripe for exploration. Yes, thank you.
Hi, Jim Trout with foreignpolicy.com. Well, first, just thank you for forcing us to examine the impulse of it can't happen because we don't want it to happen. But I just want to push back a little bit on the yes, it may happen thing. Well, I was very struck that your 2 categories are war and not war. And I say that because we live in a world now where, for example, in regard to Russia, we have endemic, low-lying, serious conflict, but not war. And as you say, for the last 70 years, what used to be routine, which is great powers going to war with each other, hasn't happened. And so my impression from what you've said is you think that's a far more frail dynamic than we think it is. But is it possible that there are so many things nowadays that are in between war and not war, all sorts of forms of conflict, which are really serious, but don't look like massacres? Because in this case, the U.S. China war would be the end of the world, right? That the answer may be something which is neither war nor not war.
Well, that's a very good question. And I'd have to think, and I will try to think harder about it. So there's no question that between not war and what I think of as war, or what in the security studies literature, for war, you got to have 1,000 combatants killed annually to just get into the correlates of war, charts. And I'm not so even much interested in those. Count for me as kind of small wars. So what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan are horrible, but those are not, quote, real big wars. So when Mattis testifies about what would happen if there's another war on the Korean Peninsula, he says, don't think of Iraq, don't think of Afghanistan, think of the last Korean War, and he calls it catastrophic. So there is something special about wars that kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people, and the whole 20th century, as we know, was basically defined by these two horrible events and the risks of a third one that might have killed all of us. So I think there's something special about big wars and big wars between big powers that could then involve the killing of millions or even many millions of people, or maybe even erase a country from the map, which if the nuclear arsenals were used in full could actually happen. Horrible is that to imagine. So I think there's no question that there's a whole set of struggles going on, and even the Chinese have a version of this they call continuous war. And if you look actually in the Chinese tradition, Sun Tzu's conception of war, as he says, if you have to fire your weapon, this is a failure. So the Chinese conception of war is, we just, like in the game of Go, we surround you with so much power that you see the outcome, so we don't have to fight about it. And I would say that's not inconsistent with what you're seeing. I still worry that as this dynamic occurs, something like the Korean Peninsula could lead one step, another step, there we are in a war. And even in the U.S.-Soviet Cold War competition, which you know very well, even though we knew that a nuclear war might kill hundreds of millions of people, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came extremely close. I mean, John Kennedy thought there was a 1 in 3 chance of a war that would kill 100 million people. And you look at it, wait a minute, So to prevent the Soviet Union having nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, we ran a 1 in 3 chance of a war that could kill 100 million people. I mean, you think, I'm glad this worked out, but this is sort of frightening. What odds will Donald Trump run to prevent a North Korea that can strike the U.S. with nuclear weapons? And I think, God help us, we're going to watch. Yes, sir.
My name is George Bulow. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm also an independent historian and foreign policy activist.
Great.
My first part of the question is to have you talk about those areas in which there was no conflict, those 4 examples. I think that there may be some interesting analogies to draw from that. And with regard to the question of China, particularly looking at Korea, I would propose something like an Austrian state treaty, that we would talk with the Japanese and talk with the South Koreans and find a way to see Korea reunited, but to guarantee the Chinese that there would not be a lot of U.S. forces, certainly above the 38th parallel, but possibly even farther south.
Both good questions and a good suggestion that's in the space of trying to be more imaginative about potential outcomes. So I would say the Austrian state treaty or some version of that, or Belgium, if you take the 19th century version, or Finland in the Cold War, would have been a great idea if we had managed to think of it about 25 years ago before the Kims had gotten the nuclear weapons. Now the challenge is a lot harder because Kim Jong-un thinks these nuclear weapons are his survival blanket, and finding a way to get him to give them up is going to be extremely difficult for anybody. And the Chinese, actually what Xi Jinping said to Trump at Mar-a-Lago is, wait a minute, you guys coming to me now telling me this is my problem. look and see where the situation stands. This is not reasonable. You haven't been able to solve this problem. You haven't asked anything like something more, you haven't been prepared to talk about anything like security on the whole peninsula before, and now you're coming to me and telling, so it's a little difficult, I think, even though I think we should be in that space looking as imaginatively as we can at things that would be highly uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, but would be better than what we're otherwise going to get. On your first question, so there are 4 cases. I could tell you all about them, but I'll just give you the names and a little clues from each. So the first comes from the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, when Spain emerges to rival Portugal. Portugal was the dominant sea power at the time. And actually, we remember Christopher Columbus and all that, who couldn't get a loan from the successors to Prince Henry, and so he went to the Spanish, and that turned out to be the sort of their big step as they became to challenge the Portuguese. So they were about to go to conflict, and the Pope, who was at the time higher than they were, I mean, both of them were Catholics, and he could excommunicate them. He said, "You can't go to war." No. So he took the map and he drew a line down the middle, down the page. And he said, this side here, this is Portuguese. This side, that's Spanish. So that's why people in Brazil speak Portuguese. That's how that story came about. In the rise of the U.S. to rival and then surpass Britain at the beginning of the 20th century is happening at the same time. The Germans are rising. And I have a fascinating case on that. So basically, the U.S. behaved about as badly as any rising power could conceivably behave. And one of my heroes, Teddy Roosevelt, I have a good chapter in the book called "What If Xi's China Were Just Like Us?" When we think of, we actually, as government officials, I've often given lectures to Chinese and everybody else about why they should be more like us, responsible and so forth. Excuse me. Teddy Roosevelt arrives in Washington when he's 37 years old. He comes from New York, goes to Washington. He's the number 2 person in the Department of the Navy. He has been saying for 15 years that it's an abomination, that's what he called it, to have these foreigners in our hemisphere, especially the Spanish, whom he didn't like, in Spain, sorry, in Cuba. So what happens in the next decade? I won't tell you the whole book, but basically there's a mysterious explosion in the Maine, in Havana Harbor. We take it as occasion to declare war on Spain. We defeat Spain quickly, liberate Cuba, take Puerto Rico, that's how we got Puerto Rico, and we pick up Guam as a spoil of war. Then we sponsor and support a coup or an insurrection in Colombia, create a whole new country, Panama. The next day gives us a contract for our canal because Teddy wanted his ships to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the Colombians wouldn't agree. Then we threaten war, first with Germany and then with Britain, over a territorial dispute in Venezuela, which they think they're going to settle. Teddy says, "You butt out or fight me." Yeah. So they leave. And then the piece I like the best is we steal the biggest part of the fat tail of Alaska. If you look at Alaska, there's this big blob, and then there's 600 mile of a strip, the tail, that cuts Canada off from the sea and runs down to the U.S. So how did that come to be ours? Well, that's a long story. Read about it in the book. John Muir tells Teddy Roosevelt, this looks like 100 Yosemites. Teddy Roosevelt says, that sounds like America. His Secretary of State says to him, no, sir, that's Canada. He says, that can't be Canada. That's like Yosemite. That's America. And we steal it, okay? Fair and square. So if China should behave with the exuberance of Teddy Roosevelt, I would say there would be no end to this story. So that's chapter 6 or chapter 5. Yes, sir.
Excuse me. Ron Barenbeim. That gentleman asked the question I was going to ask about the 4 examples, but fortunately I was given enough time to think of another question.
The other 2 examples are the Cold War and the stretch case, and the test case is the rise of Germany in the period since the end of the Cold War, since 1991, to become the predominant power in Europe. And that's a stretch case because it's not over yet, and reminds us, I believe, of the importance of Germany's having been wrapped in a security blanket called NATO, and a political an economic set of arrangements called the EU. And the test case for thinking about Thucydides is to say, imagine EU unravels. So Brexit is followed by Nexit, so now not EU. And imagine NATO unravels. So Trump says pay up or we go home, and so we go home. Now, how will the relations between Germany and France and Britain evolve over the next decade or two? And if Thucydides is right, all of a sudden people who are best buddies are going to start looking at each other, fearfully. Sure.
Actually, I was going to shift my attention elsewhere.
Wherever.
What about India? That has a significant border with China, among other things. Will have a larger population in 2020 or 2030. And also something else that I think is off of a lot of people's radar, which is the Arctic. You can now do what Henry Hudson could not. Sure. Obviously there's going to be some kind of struggle there too. So
good point. So basically, history never repeats itself, is what Mark Twain said, but it does sometimes rhyme. Okay? So basically, this is not a standard pattern. When the U.S. rose in the Western Hemisphere, it turned out there was no real competitors that were locals. China has a different picture. There's Japan, it's the third largest economy in the world and a serious military. There's India, which could, if it got its act together, be a serious competitor to China. Now, both in India and in Japan, you have very fearful countries that are more and more eager to get aligned with the U.S. so that they have somebody, helping go on their side. The South Korean case is more complicated because of their entanglement with the Chinese economy. But I think that dynamic is a different one and one to watch. And I think you could imagine an American strategy, and I think in part this is what Trump's so-called Asian strategy, which he'll give a preview of when he's on this trip this week, when he's in Vietnam, will say that we're trying to align these allies with us to try to provide some counterbalance to China. But since we're fighting with them about bilateral trade balances at the same time, it makes it more complicated. Yes.
Since you suggested an interest in solutions, I've just come back from China for a month and just returned from China for a month trip on 2 days ago. So everything that you're saying is resonant. So given the nature of the autonomous regions that China controls, what would be your response to a sense of an annexation of North Korea, which would relieve some of the pressures that China's concerned about with war having, putting North Korea in chaos and all the other
Good. Okay, so if the call is for imagination, which it is, I would say this fits on the list to look at. So now we can, in each of them, the fact that there's many cons doesn't mean that it may not be the best of the alternatives, because all of the alternatives are going to be very ugly. So the fact that it's ugly doesn't disqualify it at all. Now, if we were to say to the Chinese, look, why don't you just take North Korea, and you can annex it or do whatever the hell you want with it, but in any case, no nuclear weapons in North Korea. You take responsibility for it. I think if they would take it, Trump would probably make that deal, okay? Now, I've never talked to Xi about this. I've met him, but I haven't, to have a conversation. But I've talked to people who talk to Xi, who know him, and who are part of the government. And they say, we don't want North Korea. North Korea is a pit, okay? I mean, it's poor. Somebody's going to have to rehabilitate the whole place. It's part of the reason why the South Koreans have become more reserved. Besides, they have nuclear weapons, and we're not quite sure how to get rid of them. And besides, they got this very vicious, ruthless young man who's ruling the place. And even we had somebody there who was supposed to be his tender, the uncle, who was very friendly to the Chinese. He became suspicious of him, put him up against the wall, took an anti-aircraft gun and blew him away, okay? And then we had another guy under our protection, his half-brother in Macau, and they went and poisoned him. So maybe you take it. I mean, I would say, so this is a little bit like who wants this? But it's certainly worth to ask, does everything, do all the things that we've said in the past that are simply vested interests have to determine what we do at this point? And I think the answer is no. So I like the idea.
I think the view that he's taken on as a global leader, this might be just one of those things you gotta swallow it kind of thing. So
Okay.
thank you.
We're running out of time, and I know there are a lot of questions, so I'll just take these last four and just briefly.
Sandra Stein, going back to possibility of some negotiations, I was just reading recently that South Korea and China have reached more rapprochement. And in any deal, if it was possible, North Korea would trust us. We'd have to have China guarantee their integrity as well. But what could we give China that they would want to? And what I was thinking of from what I read is China doesn't want the U.S. As a military presence in Korea. And if we would offer to back down on that in order to make a deal and China would agree, do you think there's any feasibility in this?
Good question.
So we'll take these three.
Yeah.
just with-
Okay.
Want me to ask now? All right, well, I have three very, very quick points. No, they're quick. They're really just tuck, tuck, tuck. The first is, what about the concept of mutual assured destruction, which really worked, I think, to prevent war for many, many, many years. The second point is that this big war you keep referring to could be quite archaic within a couple of years, because with the quick development of technology, today we're all talking about cyber war. And who knows, a cyber war could completely destroy a nation, completely. And my third quick point is, that, excuse my voice, that all the years you've been referring to, the leaders of the world have been men. And you know, now I'm not saying this to be cute or to be silly, but men are controlled to a great extent by this testosterone and this machismo thing. And if somebody seems to get bigger or more powerful, they've got to strike back. Women don't respond that way. And if there were somehow that nations were ruled by women, perhaps all of these constant wars would not exist to the same extent.
Good points.
Those are my 3 points.
Good points all, please. Go ahead, Dix.
Could I ask you, please, just to keep it brief and to the point, your question? rather than
Okay,
comment?
my question will be very easy. Like, do you think China is still going to outperform economically of U.S. for the decades to come?
Last question.
Sure, I'd like you to talk a little bit about priorities for the president's trip next week in China. What are your biggest concerns? And if you were one of his handlers, what would you want to make sure that he does?
Okay, good. Great questions.
We'll continue at the reception. No, please.
Okay. So let me go backwards on the questions, if that's okay. So for my prayer for the trip to, so the president's off on this trip now to Asia, 8 days. He's going to a number of different countries, but he'll be on the 7th and 8th in Beijing with Xi Jinping, which is the most important. So if I were to have my dream, it would be that they would sit down and they'd say, this young guy, Kim Jong-un, could drag us into a war that neither of us want. So that would be crazy. So why don't we each ask a couple of people whom we trust to go off secretly and privately by themselves for 2-3 days and dream up ugly options. And they might involve the options we're talking about here, where maybe the U.S. troops have to be adjusted on the peninsula. Maybe they annex, whatever. Don't think of any constraints. The two of you just go and think of whatever you can think of and come back with at least 3 solutions, which we're going to hate, but they're going to be better than the alternative that we're otherwise going to be faced with. And I think if they were to do that, they would come back with some ideas, and we would all say, oh, well, you can't do that, you can't do that, to which the answer is, as compared to the alternative, it's always not, is this good? It's a question, is only, is it better than what's worse? Okay, so on the second question, how will the Chinese economy perform? So Herb Stein, who used to be chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, had a famous Stein's Law, which said, if a trend cannot continue forever, it won't. Okay? So for sure, China will not continue growing at the miracle rates forever. And actually, it's moved to now about 6.5%, and one would expect that it'll decline a little bit if you just were listening to the signals from the party Congress. But I think the question to ask is just the one put. If you were betting the next decade, will China continue to grow 3 times the rate of the U.S.? Well, the U.S. has barely been geeking out 2% a year. Last 2 quarters better, but if you take all of the 21st century, we've just barely averaged 2% a year. And China's been growing at 6, 7, 8, 9% a year over this period. So I have been long on China for the last decade, each year making my bet that this is not the year this collapses. And I still look optimistically about China growing faster than the U.S., though I don't like it at all. And I quote Lee Kuan Yew in the book. His view is that's most likely to happen. On women and leadership is a whole other subject. I'd be happy to talk about it. I like the idea. I think there's no question whatever that men, because we're more testosterone-driven, end up having some part of this. But if you look at the women who've made their way to the top of the greasy pole, if you take Mrs. Thatcher or Golda Meir, their behavior doesn't seem all that much more. They may have had to adjust, whatever. But in any case, if we just watch their behavior on the big war, a big war that was a cyber war in which you basically collapsed a country. That's called a big war. I mean, and in that war, many, many people would be killed because hospitals wouldn't work, there wouldn't be electricity, there would be chaos. And so I'm not, a big war for me has to do with the amount of victims, of the fatalities, not whether they're killed this way or that way. Actually, because of cyber, it's easier to escalate up the ladder once you get a conflict going than it would have been otherwise. So that's one of the lubricants in my chapter on From Here to War, how we could get there. And then finally, on the mutual assured destruction point, I think a very good point. Basically, the fact that if we have a big war with an unlimited war with China, we can destroy China, but not so successfully that it can't still respond by destroying us. So that makes war insane. And that's why it's called MAD. Mutual assured destruction really is madness. Okay? So that's a fact. But that did not prevent the Cuban Missile Crisis and a 1 in 3 chance of a war. So, well, we shouldn't do things like that. Which answer is that's right. We shouldn't do things like that. So it is part of the bedrock that provides for clarity about the fact that war is catastrophic. And it does help that the fact that if anybody comes to the table and says, I have a good idea, why don't we just go to war with China and attack them? Somebody else says, that's a great idea. Why don't we just commit suicide? If they're ready to commit suicide for our country, well, maybe we should think again. Okay? So that's produced a degree of caution, but not one that I think should be accepted complacently. Herman Kahn wrote a great book a long time ago, which he had a metaphor of the so-called doomsday machine. So what was the doomsday machine? It was the ultimate deterrent. I take one big bomb and I bury it deep in the earth. And this bomb, if it goes off, will split the earth and kill everybody on the earth. And now I'm the president, and I say, if you attack me, I'm going to push this button, and then everybody gets killed. Well, that's great, except for the fact that who's going to believe you're really going to do it because you're going to be committing suicide. So Herman's next idea is, okay, we connect this bomb to a set of sensors that sense if there's an attack on the U.S. And if there is an attack, then they explode the bomb. So there's no credibility problem. It's all automatic. That seems perfect, except for one thing. Could this malfunction? Could there be an accident? So the idea of depending on nuclear arsenals the way we do, complacently, I think, is a mistake because they're subject to life, human error.
Well, on behalf of all of us, you can see how grateful we were for giving us so much time. and
Great.
insight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to invite you all to join us and continue the conversation. Thank
Where
you.
should we go to the book
Right
fair?
behind.
Okay, good. Thank you.